For those of you who live in Virginia or have watched, you can see what his passion and ideas leads to, the results of that type of leadership. So when we're looking for, national figures to show the way for the Democratic Party, I think Governor Warner's background is about as good as you're going to find. From his personal story to what he has done professionally, both in the private sector and in the public sector, once again, he clearly shows that Democrats can make government work for everybody. They can build us a better society. Certainly did that in Virginia, and we'll see what else he can do from there. So with that, I will turn the podium over to Governor Mark Warner and thank him for being here.
Well, thank you, Adam. Thank you for those kind comments, and thank you for your support. Matter of fact, Adam has gone above and beyond the call of being supportive to me, because just last week I stole his press secretary and hired him. So, Adam, thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for what you're doing here at the NDN. Let me also talk about, where is he hobbling around? Where's Simon? All right, he's actually good, still in the room. Good. Now, I, like probably everybody here, knows Simon Rosenberg. He is, I think, somebody who is actually a very rare breed in politics. He's actually a political entrepreneur. Over the last decade, he has seen issues that have needed addressing. He's seen constituencies that needed tending. He's seen tactics that needed updating. And instead of talking about it, and let's face it, most folks in politics, all they do is talk, he's actually done something. From NDN's Hispanic Project, to his work on globalization, to his New Politics Institute. Simon, you are an innovator and a pioneer. It is now your 10th year anniversary of NDN. Man, we never thought you'd keep it going this long. I think we all owe him a great debt of gratitude. Simon, congratulations. Now, like NDN and like Adam was just talking about, I believe we need to start creating a new politics in this country. We need to not only update our tactics, but our ideas at this period of historic change. Because if we think about it, this is an extraordinary time to be alive. The changes that are sweeping through our society are fundamental. Technology-driven, globalization-driven, they are changing not only our economy, they're changing how we educate our kids, how we deliver health care, how we protect our very communities. And as somebody who spent 20 years in the venture capital business, the high-tech venture capital business, before I transitioned to politics, I got to tell you, if you think the last 10 years have been wild, you haven't seen anything yet. The next decade is going to be even more transforming. Now just think about it for a moment. If America were truly united, if we actually embraced this change that was sweeping through the world, if we truly used our power to lead, just think what we could accomplish. But as I think most of us know, and particularly those of us who either live here in Washington or around Washington, that's not what we're getting. Instead of unity, we get division. Instead of international leadership, we get isolation. And instead of grappling and leading in a global economy that could actually enhance opportunity for too many in this country, we're struggling just barely to keep up. Now, our history is full of times when our country has faced enormous challenges. But I can't think of at least a time in my lifetime when we faced more challenges all at once. America's stature and insecurity in the world, from the very real threat of global terrorism, the lack of a national energy policy, no national competitiveness strategy, fiscal meltdown, and no meaningful action in sight. Now, I could talk about each of these, but today I want to talk about an issue that is often overlooked or misunderstood, and that is America's ability to compete in this global economy. Let me tell you a quick story about at least what I think we face. As governor, I took a lot of trade missions. One of them, though, was to India, an extraordinary country that's literally caught, perhaps more vividly than any country in the world, the transformation between the past and the future. I saw extraordinary things in India. I met with the Prime Minister, I met with government leaders, I met with business leaders. But the image that struck in my mind the most was not any of those meetings. It was actually a trip I took to one of the worst slums in Delhi. Now, this was the real deal. This was, your kind of ultimate image of what a third world slum was. Thousands of corrugated tin shacks, no running water, dirt floors, kids that spent their day begging rather than going to school. And what I was doing there was I was visiting this NGO that had this project called the Hole in the Wall. Being from the South, I thought the Hole in the Wall was a barbecue place. This was not a barbecue place. The Hole in the Wall was literally that. It was a series of computers that had been put in a concrete cinder block wall with no walls around it, a tin roof. And they were trying to see what happens. They would turn the computers on in the morning, they'd turn them off at night, no teachers. See how the kids reacted. And these poverty-stricken kids who didn't, most of them didn't go to school, had grappled and mastered and used this technology. I'll always remember there was a young guy named Samir. And he came up and met me. I'm here, the visiting dignitary, and Mac, you've been on these kind of trips. The kid comes up and he asked me my name. And I go, why do you want to know my name? He goes, well, I want to Google you to see if you're important. And I had two immediate reactions. The first was to, feel enormous pride. Here, American technology, halfway across the world, in this place of abject poverty, is empowering these children, hopefully, to get a better life. But to be honest with you, almost as quickly as I had that thought, a second thought hit in my mind. The race is on for the 21st century. The race is on for the future. Who's going to get there first? Who's going to lead in this period of transformative change? Because kids in India, Samir and his young friends, just as kids in China and elsewhere around the world, they're going to be competing for the very same jobs that my daughters are going to be competing for. And anyone that travels the world knows that places like India and China are not playing for second place. So it makes no sense to me that in 2006, America has no really effective plan to get into this race and succeed. And I think that's going to take, as we think about a new politics, a fundamental shift in our thinking. Because politics in the 21st century are not going to be the left versus the right, liberal versus conservative, or sure as heck's not going to be red versus blue. It's going to be about the future versus the past. It's about whether we as a nation are going to be able to answer history's call at this moment of transformative change. And it's going to be, as Adam mentioned, whether we can protect, preserve, and enhance what I think is the most quintessential American value. And that is that everybody in this country ought to get a fair shot at the American dream. And getting that fair shot shouldn't have to depend on who your parents were, what color your skin is, where you were born, where you went to school. Probably everybody in this room has lived some version of their own American dream. But we're not going to make sure that we maintain that unless we have truly a different kind of politics, a different kind of approach, and a national effort. And I believe with all my heart that the American people are ready for leadership that will empower them to compete and be successful in this global economy. And that's why we need a clearly articulated, comprehensive national strategy on competitiveness. Let me give you some of the ideas, components of what that strategy would look like. First, obviously, education. America's not going to make it unless we have the most educated, most innovative, and most entrepreneurial workforce in the world. Research and development, because America's greatest strength has been our innovation. Over 50% of our economic growth over the last half-century came from innovation. And intellectual capital is increasingly going to be the currency of the 21st century. Take a whole new approach to healthcare, because healthcare is no longer simply a moral or social issue regarding 45 million Americans without any healthcare, but it is because if Ford and General Motors go under, it's not about our wage rates, it's because we don't have a competitive healthcare system. Energy. It's remarkable that America may be the only industrialized country in the world that hasn't truly connected the dots between national security, energy policy, the pursuit of renewable energy sources that could create American jobs, and you know what? If we got it right, we might just save the planet along the way. Infrastructure. Infrastructure, and it's not just for those of us who live in this area in terms of roads. Roads, rail, airports, and infrastructure is also things we don't think about or see until it's too late. The faulty power grid, the water and sewer systems, or as we saw tragically last fall, not adequate levees. And it's remarkable that our country, which created the internet, has now fallen to 16th in the world in terms of broadband deployment. Trade, because the rush of people, goods, ideas across borders is not going to decrease, it's only going to increase. And when that happens, we've got to make sure that we enforce the rules fairly so that intellectual piracy doesn't continue to take billions of dollars out of our economy, and so that countries who don't play by the rules can't continue to siphon off American jobs. Fiscal policy. If we continue to borrow and run up staggering deficits, the implications that will have not only for future generations, but for us in our lifetime will be transformative. Think about it for a moment. Wouldn't it be a great prerequisite that anybody who actually decided they wanted to run for Congress had to prove they could read a balance sheet? And truly, a national approach to workforce development. Because if we're going to make sure offering that fair shot in America remains, we've got to also link that to a policy that would ensure that that fair shot should be available everywhere in America and that you shouldn't have to leave your hometown to find a 21st century job. Now, I would love to go on about all 8 of these, but I understand Simon's only got the room until 5. So what I'd like to do today, and I hope in the future days to talk about every one of these, I'd like to talk about 3 of these issues. Education, research and development, and workforce development. It begins with education. We're not going to be able to compete in this changing economy unless and until every child, no matter how inner city their neighborhood or how rural their neighborhood, receives the educational skills to be able to compete in a 21st century economy. Now, how are we going to get that done on a national level? Let me give you 3 suggestions. First, we've actually got to get our policymakers out of their silos. Now, when I became governor of Virginia, and there was no area I spent more time on than education, what was absolutely fascinating to me was how rarely people in education talk to each other. The preschool community never talks to the K-12 community. And my gosh, to actually get higher ed to engage with preschool or K-12 is virtually impossible. And federal education policy as it currently stands actually reinforces those silos. Think about it. Head Start, No Child Left Behind, the Perkins Act, the Higher Ed Act. There's often talk in education about curriculum alignment. Wouldn't it be great if there was actually federal education policy alignment? Right now, one hand doesn't know what the other hand's doing. And instead of lining up funding goals, policy goals in any type of rational system, we end up keeping folks in silos. Wouldn't it be remarkable if universities were actually engaged in remaking American high schools? If we actually thought about education as a continuum from preschool to graduate school? Now, if we're going to do that, that brings to the second issue. We've got to get all the right folks at the table. Now, that would seem rather easy. You had federal educators, local educators, state policy educators, all together. But oftentimes when we think about education policy, we only think about it from the governmental standpoint. Too often we forget other critical pieces. That's the business community and the nonprofit and foundation world. Particularly the nonprofit and foundation world, where oftentimes the most bold experimentation is taking place. Together, business and the nonprofit world spends close to $34 billion a year on education in this country. Yet, how often is that bold new initiative that's funded by a foundation ever taken to scale? So if we're going to really think differently about education, all of these players have to be seated at the same table. That brings to a third point. We've actually got to be willing to measure results. As chairman of the National Governors Association, I started an initiative to look at the American high school, reforming the American high school. And what was amazing to me was, until 2 years ago, there was no common definition in this country about what high school graduation meant. So a high school graduation in Virginia was totally different from what it meant in Ohio. The governors, working again with the feds a little bit here, we set a common graduation rate. We actually launched high school reform programs in more than 30 states. But there's still so much more to be done. We don't have a common definition in terms of dropout rates, and that problem increasingly could be a national tragedy. And while standardized tests by any means are not perfect, we've got to have common measurements to be able to keep score in terms of how our students are doing, not only vis-a-vis their national competitors, but vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And you've always got to be innovative. Let me very quickly, I've got friends like Brian Moran here from our legislature, give you a couple of things we tried in Virginia. I can't speak about all the states you live in, but in Virginia what we would consistently do is we would put our least experienced teachers in our toughest schools, that inner city school or that rural school. And for the 50% that didn't quit after the first 5 years, they would then oftentimes get hired away by the more affluent suburban school. And the tough school would have to start all over again. So here's what we started. We started paying from the state a $15,000 bonus to quality experienced teachers to go back into that underperforming school and stay for a minimum of 3 years. And then if the school improved, we'd end up paying bonuses to everybody else in the school as well. I was a business entrepreneur. I'd love to say every company I invested in was a success. It wasn't. When it wasn't a success, we knew where to turn. We turned to turnaround specialists. So we challenged our top universities and private sector to create a turnaround specialist program for principals to give them additional training, support, resources, again, to go into underperforming schools, stay for a minimum of 3 years, and get results. We said we're going to change every high school in Virginia. Now in every high school in Virginia, no matter how urban or no matter how rural, every child who's college-bound can earn a minimum of a semester's worth of college credit in high school and have it count at any university in Virginia. You suddenly start collapsing high school and college together. First-generation kids get exposed to more rigorous work. You actually end up saving parents thousands of dollars off the cost of higher education. And we also took a whole new look at the world of those who are non-college bound. We said we're going to put as much value on you if you choose to be a plumber or an electrician as if you're going to be a doctor and a lawyer. And we guarantee to everyone, you pass and graduate from high school in Virginia, we're going to get you not only a high school diploma, but an industry certification. And we'll give you a free semester at the community college to finish getting that industry certification. 50 of them, electrician, auto mechanic, computer technician, nurse's aide. You take somebody who otherwise might be flipping burgers at minimum wage, and you actually give them a career path. And we said to everyone in the education world, we're going to measure. Let me give you a quick report. Virginia had the largest increase in the country in math SAT scores. We had double-digit increases in the number of students taking advanced placement courses, and 24% increase in African American, 21% increase in Latino students. In 4 years, we went from 42% of our schools fully accredited to over 92%. And even though we raised our graduation rate requirements, we have north of a statewide average, north of 94% of graduating high school seniors. We've started to move the needle on making sure we've got that innovative, entrepreneurial, and technologically equipped workforce. Now, I'm not saying that education shouldn't remain a state and local priority. That is appropriate. But think what would happen in this country if we had national leadership that was relentless in their focus on as an advocate for education. If we could have that focus on education on a national level, it could produce positive results, I think, for decades to come. Brings me to my second point, research and development. It makes no sense to me that a time when technology and innovation has been more important than ever, that American R&D as a percentage of our GDP has fallen to 6th in the world. It makes no sense to me that a time when science is actually shaping more and more of our economy and daily lives, that there are some public policymakers that are debating the very merits of science. It's 2006, and we have folks denying global warming, denying the ability to do stem cell research. Heck, we even have folks wanting to redebate evolution. Think about it for a moment. Over the 20th century, at the federal level, research and development has traditionally been about national security. Now, in the 20th century, that meant better bombs, more robust missile systems, more agile satellites. But in the 21st century, we need to think about a different kind of connection between research and development and national security. In the 21st century, that means putting more resources, R&D, national security resources, into epidemic prevention, cybersecurity, communications between first responders, and energy. Give you one statistic. We spend, total federal government, less than $2 billion a year, total federal energy R&D. We spend $7.1 billion on a conservative estimate a month in Iraq. If we redeployed 2 weeks of Iraqi spending into energy R&D, we could triple our energy R&D efforts. Of course, that would require an administration that believes in science. But it's those kind of ideas and innovation that's going to be required. If we did that, we actually could maybe change our current energy policy, which is let's go borrow money from China to buy oil from countries around the world that don't like us. Not exactly something that enhances our national security, nor addresses the issues of global warming around this country. Another area, we need to look at our national labs. Those labs were beacons of progress for the 21st century. And unfortunately, if we look at our national labs, that's where most of them are stuck, in the 20th century. We need to make our national labs once again centers of innovation, not just centers of employment. They ought to be the places that are creating that next great new breakthrough. At the state and university level, we need to integrate our efforts. Increasingly, we've seen states start to step up on research and development as the federal government and this administration has backed away from research and development. Look at the California Stem Cell Research Initiative. But what we've got to guard against is making our states and our universities islands of innovation. I think they actually need to be hubs on a bigger network. That's why we need to continue to focus on developing the next generation of internet technologies. That means we've got to build even bigger broadband pipes so that our universities and our scientists can actually collaborate in a 21st century way. And while we're doing this, particularly with the internet, let's make sure we maintain net neutrality so we can actually maintain that level playing field. At the same time, we need to do more to support R&D in the private sector. And that means, I believe, a permanent extension of the R&D tax credit. That means better incentives and a whole new way to look at how government can actually assist the venture capital community. Better incentives for the private sector to do more research on its own. We need to think differently about how we get ideas from the lab into the marketplace, particularly through the university patent processes. And I think there should be ways to re-examine how we can speed up the process through the FDA of getting life-saving ideas again into the marketplace. 40 years ago, in the shadow of Sputnik, President Kennedy called for putting a man on the moon within a decade. In many ways, that call spurred innovation and creativity, particularly in math and science, for decades to come. Again, because there was national leadership. And that's why our national government needs to support research and development, not to pick winners and losers, but to set priorities and to leverage the power of American innovation to make that next great new breakthrough, that next breakthrough that will probably create American jobs. And that brings me to the final area I want to cover, making sure everybody still gets that fair shot at the American dream. Now, I think this has to include new Americans. In the debate over immigration over the last few weeks, I think what has been sadly missing from the debate has been a focus on legal immigration and the value it brings to this country. We need to continue to attract the world's best and brightest. We need more student visas. We need more H-1B visas. We need to say to those who want to come study, learn here, after you get that degree, if you want to stay, we want to welcome you to be part of our American family. Come get your fair shot at the American dream in this great country. And while we do that, we can't forget that we cannot leave rural America behind. We've got to ask ourselves, what's going to happen to the tobacco worker, the textile worker, the manufacturing worker in the 21st century? What happens after the mill or the plants close down? Let me again tell you a quick little story about a town called Lebanon, Virginia. Now, Lebanon is kind of 100 miles from nowhere, coal mining community in Appalachia. It's the kind of place that if you got out of high school and went to college, chances were you probably weren't coming back. There may be some of you in this room that grew up in towns like that. But we said that if the world was going to continue to outsource jobs to Bangalore, we ought to also be able to create knowledge-based jobs in places like Lebanon. We started doing things differently. We got a lot of folks back into the race by actually getting 35,000 Virginians their GED in a pretty innovative partnership with NASCAR. I tell you, it's one thing for the governor to go back and get your GED. It's another thing if Elliott Sadler says it. Mac, I guess a lot of these folks don't know who Elliott Sadler is in this room. Let me give you a quick aside. If we're going to get back in red America, you all better learn who Elliott Sadler is right here and now. We said we're going to go ahead and put in the biggest rural broadband deployment in the whole country, 700 miles to 700,000 rural Virginians. We did the reforms I mentioned in education. We said to those kids in Lebanon, if you work hard, we'll try to do our part to make sure you get that fair shot, that you can actually live out that fair shot in the town you grew up in. Well, my best day as governor came near the end of my term. It was about 8 weeks before I was done, and I was in a high school gym in Lebanon. And what I was there doing was we were announcing 300 jobs. Now, these were not call center jobs. These were 300 software design jobs. These were the kind of jobs that any community in America would have loved to have had. One young man went up and told the Washington Post, he said, you know, before this, I always thought I'd have to move away to raise my family. Now I can actually stay here. The hope those jobs brought to that community, that sense that there should be that fair shot, no matter where in this country, started to become a reality, at least that day in that community. In a lot of ways, that was why I ran for office in the first place. Now, our country has never been tested as much as we are right now. But I got to tell you, and it's going to take the skill and talents of all of us and all the American people to get us back on the right track. You know, as I travel around the country, now that I'm unemployed, I'm out spending a lot of times with Democratic audiences, and they always want to ask me the same thing. Governor, what do you disagree with the president the most on? Well, there's a long list. But my biggest problem with this president is actually not something he's done. My biggest problem with this president is something that he's not done. And that is that this president has never asked us to step up. He's never asked us for shared sacrifice. He's never asked us as the American people to actually roll up our sleeves and be part of the solution. I got to tell you, after 9/11, you and I and all Americans, we would have done anything for our country. But the president really never asked. Regardless of what we feel about the war in Iraq, after our troops were in harm's way, if there had been a call that would have said, hey, maybe we ought to change our energy policy so that we're no longer as dependent upon the Persian Gulf, Americans would have responded. But the president never asked. As recently as last fall, when we saw those horrible images, not of some foreign country, but of America in the aftermath of Katrina, if somebody would have said, hey, it's not right that Americans are dying in the street because government can't deliver basic services and we don't have a 21st century infrastructure, I know you would have, I would have, Americans would have answered that call. But the president never asked. Instead, what do we get? We get his crowd and Karl Rove practicing the politics of division, of red and blue America, of leadership that stokes the fires of the past rather than trying to harness the potential of the future. Now, the American people, I know, are ready to step up. They're ready to be part of the solution. They understand that we are living in a time of transformative change, of harrowing threats and historic opportunity. Folks, it is time for a different kind of politics, a different kind of leadership in this country. Now, it's not going to be easy. I'd love to say it's going to be as easy as simply we're going to elect some new folks to Congress, they're going to pass a law, and everything's going to get fixed. But it's not going to be that easy. It's going to have to recognize, and start with a recognition from all of us, that it's not an American birthright that we're always going to live in the most successful and prosperous country in the world. Each generation has to earn that right through innovation and hard work. Each generation has to recognize the consequences of its actions or of its failure to act. Each generation has to be charged with protecting that most quintessential American value, that notion that everybody in this country ought to get a fair shake and a fair shot at the American dream. Now, time and again, it has been our party, the Democratic Party, that's led the way. And I, for one, believe it's time for us to write the next new chapter of our party, and more importantly, of our country. It's time to issue that call to the American people. It's time to ask them to roll up their sleeves and be part of this solution. It's time for American leadership that's actually willing to look a little bit farther down the road, to tap into what is still our greatest asset, that boundless optimism that Americans have, our innovation, and our desire to do the right thing. Now, that's what our Democratic Party should be about. That's what we start doing this year by changing the Congress. That's what we start doing and continue doing in 2008 when we take back the White House. This organization, NDN, has been essential in starting to create the ideas and policies that's going to help us lead that way. I thank you for being here. I thank you for your commitment to this country. Let's go out and make it happen. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.